All right. So again, this is going to be, I think, a lot of information kind of condensed into a short period of time. I do think this is a reading where it's not the longest reading, but there is a lot of information, a lot of legislation, a lot of facts that are mentioned. So I'm hoping that by going through this, it helps narrow it down. And I always like to point out to students that this is a reading where I really think the graphic organizer that I put together could be helpful, or at least maybe for me, it would be helpful. Um, I gave you both a handout with some specific questions on it, but then the graphic organizer, what it tries to do is split the two kind of key areas that the author is trying to cover in terms of equality and constitutional legacy, and then also look at this sort of specific context for African Americans. So hopefully that graphic organizer can kind of help. And so what we want to look at is, in addition, I would say to the questions that I have on the PowerPoint related to objectives, is that tale of two Browns is both a tale of equality on the one side in the constitutional legacy, which we're going to look at through uh, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, Plessy, and then Brown. And then on the other side, we're going to look at African Americans in education in the Reconstruction era, the Jim Crow era, and then the post Brown era. And so those are key kind of points that I want to make sure we cover and get through, and then some related issues on top of that. I always like to point out the author was someone I studied with at the University of Illinois. He's a very, very famous historian. He's been quoted in the Supreme Court, testified in a number of major cases around the United States, um, and written a very influential book that's related to this topic. And so where James Anderson begins this piece, and as a side note, I want to say in many ways this what we read is really kind of reflects his personality in a lot of ways. He's what I think he's really trying to do is find a really balanced perspective and look at both sides of things, and kind of bring those two things together. And so where he opens the reading is a reference to Derek Bell and Derek Bell's book, which is the cover, Silent Covenants, that's on the slide. And Derek Bell begins his book at a Yale commencement where they reference Brown versus Board of Education, and he says everybody stands up and begins clapping. And Derek Bell begins to think to himself, why is something that promised so much but accomplished so little? Why does it have such a highly regarded, hallowed place in America's consciousness, collective consciousness? And that's what. So Derek Bell, I think who's a famous civil rights lawyer, really has a kind of, maybe you could say in some ways somewhat pessimistic or critical look at Brown. What James Anderson wants to do, I think, is both accept and acknowledge that side of the story, but also the other side of it. And so to do that, he goes back to the Declaration of Independence. And the Declaration of Independence begins, obviously, we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal. And so there's a reference in the Declaration to what Dr. Anderson calls substantive equality or individual equality, that citizens of the United States, that human beings have these inherent rights. But obviously what happens is when 10 years after the Declaration of Independence, when people sit down, our founders sit down to write the actual Constitution, it's virtually impossible to inscribe that into the Constitution at that time period. And the reason for that, one of the main reasons, is slavery. The other reason would be obviously women at that time period did not share equality, and we've talked about that in class prior. Um, but slavery ends up really preventing any substantial discussion, any real discussion of individual equality in the Constitution. So our constitutions are written. We have a period of time, and then we have the Civil War, obviously, and then a number of key amendments to the Constitution follow the Civil War. Um, if you've seen the movie Lincoln, which by the way is a good movie, it's a bit dated now, but Daniel Day Lewis plays Abraham Lincoln. The movie, though, isn't really about his life. It's about the passing of the 13th Amendment. And the 13th Amendment to the Constitution banned slavery. So that was one key. And then the other one, the 15th Amendment expanded civil right or universal suffrage to males. Women didn't get the right to vote to a significant time period later, but till the 1920s. But in that time period, men got to vote. Now that needs a really important caveat, because of course, black men did not get the right to vote in much of the United States at that time period. It wasn't until the 1960s when we get the Voting Rights Act and get rid of a lot of the things like literacy, a lot of the other blocks that were put in the way of African Americans. It wasn't until that time that widespread access to voting occurred for African Americans. If you get a chance, I would highly recommend the movie Selma, to watch that movie because it details that fight for the Voting Rights Act. And we're going to talk about the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is actually the one that's central to our discussion here. So, following, in the Reconstruction era, and with, the Du Bois reading, what I try to talk about is that, racial progress and rights in this country is not just a straight line. There's a lot of periods of expansion of rights, contractions, reactions. So it's a very complicated, I think, history when you look at the progress that's been made. But in the Reconstruction era, there was really a number of moves for expanding civil rights, and it was a more positive period. One of the examples that I want to give of this is the Representative Charles Sumner, who was a progressive legislator of the time period, who wanted the word white removed from the naturalization clause. And one of the reasons this is key, I think, for a lot of people who immigrated to the United States on their own, they would have identified with an ethnic identity as Irish or Italian or German. When they got to the U.S., they began to associate with white, and I think the reason for that had to do that being white had a lot to do with rights and being considered a citizen. This is a reason why, as a side note, why most academics would point to the birther controversy, the idea that President Obama was not born here, is inherently racist, because this history that existed in the United States around naturalization, citizenship, and rights. And so the key point that I want you to remember is Charles Sumner wanted that removed from the naturalization clause because it violated the principle of individual equality from the Declaration of Independence. That was the basis upon which he wanted the word white removed. All right, so here's the graphic organizer that I referenced at the beginning, and if you look on the using this software sometimes confusing to say left or right. I think if you're looking at the screen, it would be on your left-hand side. Starting with what I like to do is use a key phrase for each of the pieces of legislation to help you remember them. For the Declaration of Independence, I want you to remember the relationship to equality using the phrase, all men created equal. So the Declaration of Independence espoused individual equality or substantive equality. The Constitution has no reference to individual equality. The only reference to equality is equal representation in the legislature. And the full quote is basically like equal representation in the upper house of the national legislature. It's a bit more involved, but that quote, I think, that's the only reference to equality that exists in the Constitution. It's not about individuals, it's about our Congress and representation. The 14th Amendment is the Equal Protection Clause, and I think you would be okay if you just remembered either equal protection under the law or the Equal Protection Clause. The 14th Amendment, I'll just say, and one example I can give is from traveling in other countries. For me personally, at least, in a number of countries, it really, really makes me appreciate my American citizenship, because the 14th Amendment has all of these sort of things, like you have, um, due process. You have, you can't just be nabbed off the street and put into um, prison. You have the right to representation, against self-incrimination, all those things. But the core of the 14th Amendment is broadly that there's one group of rights holders. You can't hold one group to a different standard under the law than others. And to give you a contemporary example of this, marriage equality was, when the Supreme Court ruled in favor of marriage equality, they did so on the basis of the 14th Amendment, that you can't have, um, one group of who has a right that is denied to a broader group of people. Obviously, in practice, it's a little bit hard to always delineate that, but the 14th Amendment has led to the expansion of rights for broad groups of individuals, which we'll get into. One of the things that happens is, after the 14th Amendment, at that time period, there's a reaction against it. And we get a number of cases that are detailed in the piece. What I want you to remember specifically is Plessy v. Ferguson. This is where a civil rights activist who was African American boarded a train and sat in the whites only area. He was arrested. He took it to court. Went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said separate facilities were constitutional as long as they were equal. And so the phrase to remember with Plessy is separate but equal. Now, what we're going to get into in detail is that was never the case in the context of education. And really, the Jim Crow era, what Plessy ushered in was the Jim Crow era, or the United States, history of apartheid, almost a 60-year period of legal segregation. And really, I think, we remember it a lot. We look at separate facilities, but really it was about two separate systems, with one group denied equal access rights. And so to follow up then with Brown versus Board of Education, what Brown rules, and the key phrase to remember here is, separate is inherently unequal. Separate facilities are inherently unequal. And so that's what the Brown decision did. In class, I like to go a little more in depth, and because the reading we did doesn't talk too much in depth about the case. I'll just mention I was at the 50th anniversary of Brown versus Board, and got to meet some of the people who at the time were children. Their parents were all part of the civil rights movement. It was just interesting to hear about them being little kids, kind of playing together in the backyard while their parents sat around in the kitchen and, developed a plan to deal with segregated schooling. But essentially, the Brown, we know it as Brown. There were 5 different cases, but Brown was alphabetically the first name on the docket. So there were 5 other cases that went along with Brown. And what civil rights activists wanted to do was challenge the very notion of separate but equal. And for that, they used Kenneth Clark's famous doll study, which I'll share a video on the Canvas site to illustrate this. There's a young girl a high school student who redid basically the Kenneth Clark doll study. But in that study, what he tried to show was that segregation has a negative psychological impact on children. This is a kind of a map to give you an idea. The states in all black have had laws in the 1950s mandating segregation. In a lot of other states, it was done on a district-by-district basis. But I would say for the most part, we've also talked about Hispanic students and segregation in California, New Mexico, and then into Texas and things like that. Indiana, as a reference, actually ended legal segregation a year before the Brown case, 1 year before. But of course, and we'll kind of get to this, that didn't necessarily lead to integrated schools in Indiana. It's not that they're necessarily integrated today. And if you go back through pictures of that time period, you can clearly see that separate was not equal. That African Americans, and I'm going to give you specific examples of this, denied access to education. All right. So moving now, switching to the other tale of Brown. So that's you know, the tale of two Browns is one, the constitutional legacy side. But let me just hit one point before we switch sides to the other one. Is that when Brown reintroduced the 14th Amendment, overturned Plessy, and reintroduced individual equality into the constitutional legacy, there are a number of rights that then are included into the United States, or a number of different cases or struggles for civil rights that happen. And to give you examples of these, the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, is predicated on the 14th Amendment, that idea of one group of rights holders. So the Americans with Disabilities Act, and then of course out of ADA you get 94-142, or the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which applies ADA to schools. So you get that movement. You get Title IX. Title IX, a lot of people think of as women, related to women's rights and women's sports in higher education, but really what Title IX does is, opens up higher education, post-secondary education access for women, and it's applied to a number of different areas for women's rights. You also get laws, against employment discrimination of the elderly, bilingual education. The Bilingual Education Act also happens shortly after Brown. So there are a number of key legislative cases expanding equality to different groups. And then, of course, I mentioned that even today, marriage equality, recent movements predicated on this basis. Switching now to the other side, what I want to point out is the Reconstruction era was a relatively positive time period for African Americans. Although, again, when you say relative, this is coming out of slavery, the end of slavery. But what the author points out is that, using Alabama as an example, Black African Americans make up 44% of the population. They actually receive a significant proportion of funding, 44% of the funding, for educational opportunity. And we talked about this with Du Bois as well, that during this time period, there was actually a movement to provide educational opportunity. When Jim Crow happens, that's undermined and attacked. And so to give you an example of that with Alabama, going back to it again, African Americans make up 44% of the population. They receive about 12 to 15% of education funding. Mississippi, you get even greater disparities, other southern states. That's what I mean when I say separate was not equal. One of the key things that I want you to remember, a concept with the Jim Crow era, is double taxation. Double taxation means that African Americans paid for white schools through their taxes. They were taxed to pay for public education for white students, and then often forced to pay for their own schools out of pocket. And there were a lot of examples of this given in the reading. One example would be the Rosenwald schools, which were done through philanthropic efforts to raise money and created a network of schools through the South. Another example that I want to give of the disparities are high schools, and the examples given of a case of Ware High School, pointing out that Virginia had one high school for African American students into the 20th century. Georgia wanted to reallocate that high school to close it down and reopen it as an elementary school. The parents fought it. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court allowed Georgia to close that high school. And I'm sorry I don't have it to read verbatim. I generally read it in class, but I would recommend going back to the reading to this section. And James Anderson points out that it wasn't an isolated incident. He says this was a part of a systematic system of inequality, and points out that a number of states did not have high school or secondary education for Black students throughout the 20th century. and he lists a number of states that did not have any high schools, and then a few other states like Maryland and Florida that had one high school available for black students through the 20th century up until the Second World War. So African Americans were, by and large, throughout the United States, denied secondary education through much of the 20th century, um, through the Jim Crow era. So one of the outcomes of the Brown decision um, was that high school graduation rates for the black community, they rise after Brown versus Board of Education. But what I want to talk about is with Brown versus Board of Education, the post-Brown era was a double. He calls it a double-edged sword for the black community. On one hand, it was celebrated. It was this positive development that happened. But the black community immediately realized that there was a tremendous backlash against the Brown ruling. One example of this, I mean, I think that illustrates it very clearly, is the Brown decision happens in 1954. We don't get see the federalization of federal troops going into the South to integrate schools until well into the 1960s. I mean, it isn't really until the later 1960s that you get things like the Little Rock Nine, and even small movements toward integrating schools. It's a very slow but also violent process that happened. The South just ignored the law. They commissioned long studies, and in some cases, literally areas just shut down their entire public school system. And in the PowerPoint, I tried to include some of the famous photos from the time period. Schools were also attacked. They were burnt. They were blown up. A really tremendous backlash. One example of this would be, and we'll kind of come back to this at the end, but Prince George's County literally closed their school system down for 5 years rather than integrating. And again, this is in the 1960s. When schools did begin to integrate, it had unexpected consequences for the black community. And this too is a key point that I want you to take away from the reading. That for the black community, the loss of black schools meant three things that are highlighted. One, the loss of culture and heritage. Dr. Anderson points out that he says basically, like, after the church, the school was the most central kind of institution in the black community for culture and heritage and connection. If you've ever seen the movie Remember the Titans, it's kind of detailed in that movie. But the loss of sports teams, heritage, those types of things. It decimated the career of African American teachers, and there are statistics given in the reading, that year after year as integration progresses, 40,000 teachers are lost per year. This is something, as a side note, we haven't recovered from. There's still we still lack an adequate number of African American teachers, and another issue that as a country needs to be worked on, and as well the loss of black educators and administrators. A kind of additional point to add here that's not on the PowerPoint to emphasize is that as well that even with integration, a lot of times black students were subjected to hostile environments, and then often resegregated through other means. This is something we're going to talk about in the last few weeks of class. We'll talk about tracking today, and we'll look at the statistics from the Department of Justice and on tracking as a form of resegregation. And this is something that happened stemming out of this time period as well. All right. So going back to that point about Prince Edward County, I would just mention that there was in the reading a gentleman who was interviewed in the 1990s. They gave him they put on a symbolic ceremony and gave some of the kids who were affected by that point of time honor, high school diplomas. And a man interviewed for that says, look, basically what I needed from the school system was denied to me. What I needed was an education, and that was denied to me. And what James Anderson says is basically that man speaks on behalf of a whole generation of African Americans from that time period denied educational opportunity. So moving into the contemporary time period, this is kind of a graph. It's a bit selected data. It begins in the 1960s. The uptick you see on the screen would be a positive movement toward integration. And what I want to point out is that from the 1970s through the 1980s, we saw a genuine movement toward integration and integrated schools. Then that begins to unravel in the 1990s, and up to the year 2000 basically is undone. Now, we don't have de jure segregation anymore. We don't have legal segregation following the Brown case. But what we do have is called de facto segregation, and that means segregation by circumstance. And I think the biggest circumstance related to this chart would be residential segregation, which is not by accident. I mean, it was engineered that way. There was things called redlining, specific practices that were done to keep neighborhoods segregated, to keep African Americans out of white neighborhoods. And so when we got the breakdown of integration efforts, that led to a resegregating of schools. Now, Gary Orfield, who runs the Center for Civil Rights, the Office for Civil Rights Data, that the charts I'm going to show you, the next few charts, are drawn from, what he terms he calls intensely segregated schools being anything that's 90% or above one racial demographic. So if a school's 90% or more students of color, or 90% or more white, those are considered intensely segregated schools. And a lot of schools that we have today, I think there's a kind of cognitive disconnect where a lot of people sort of think schools are not segregated because the feeling is, well, that ended in the 1960s. But I think if you push people a little bit about their own school experience or what they know about schools in certain communities today, they will point out that schools are still segregated. One of the things related to this is one of the attempts at integrating schools that was undone by the Supreme Court in recent years was the busing effort. And I'll share a video on Canvas with you. I play this in class, but in the Democratic primaries, this came up. Joe Biden, who potentially seems like he's going to be possibly, I'm talking about this in day 4 of the election outcome, and it looks like he might go on to become president. But he, at the time period, opposed mandated forced busing programs, and he was called out on this in the primaries by what looks to be the future vice president of the United States, Kamala Harris, who posted this picture on Twitter, who was bused in her district in Berkeley, and was basically, a girl who, from her perspective, or I think what she would say, benefited from a busing program. And so busing was a program to basically integrate different schools. And so some school students would end up on a bus going to a different school system to help with the integration effort. I'll mention as a side note, Kamala Harris's program was voluntary, so it would have been one that Senator Biden would have approved of, or that he said he supported at the time period. And then he dedicates about 5 pages of his most recent memoir on his opposition to busing, and talks about even black parents in Delaware, in his community, concerned about busing their children, a significant ways away from their own neighborhood. And so I would just say, at the very least, it's a complicated complicated issue, and I think it's helpful to point out in the context that the president, um, or what now may today be our former president, uh, has also been cited, and his organization's been cited for residential um, discrimination, or essentially not renting to African Americans. That residential segregation or discrimination is a key part too of this overarching issue related to busing. I like to mention that Indianapolis had a busing program, and the Atlantic did a really, really good story on Indianapolis's busing program through the 1980s. And this was a cartoon from the time period. I posted the Atlantic article on the Canvas site. If you get a chance, I highly recommend reading it. And essentially, what you find in Indianapolis is similar to other communities that, and really, Indianapolis was divided up into different districts in a way that early on contributed to segregation. The busing program created integration. When the busing program broke down, Indianapolis schools essentially resegregated. I should point out, and this is true, I think, for Indiana as well. There has been some positive movement. I mean, it's not an overall grim picture. One, I think, really good sign is there's been a thaw nationally in residential segregation. More African Americans are moving to and living in more diverse neighborhoods. White neighborhoods are becoming more diverse. We are seeing a growth in white schools that have an increased number of minority students. But nationally, there's still an issue with segregation. Residential segregation is, I think, the overarching problem. Another issue that contributed a bit would be Latino immigration through the 1990s. There was a major spike in Latino immigration, and so in places in California, still really segregated. Texas, segregated. Here's a map. This is a 2015 map of Indiana, and you can see the more dark orange, predominantly white schools. The lighter colors tend to be somewhat mixed. The darker blue tend to be predominantly African American, and those areas of predominant blue, you can see areas like Gary, Indianapolis. So there's some data here if you want to look through it. I did update the PowerPoint. This is the most recent Office of Civil Rights data available. It goes into the 2016-2017 school year. And one of the things here you can see with this graph, that white schools, as I mentioned, are kind of growing slowly, but somewhat more diverse, and diversity increasing in white schools. And as another quick note, New York, sometimes, to say white liberals tend to maybe think that segregation and racism is exclusively a problem of the South, and that's clearly not the case. And New York has had a very contentious, ongoing fight to integrate their school system, and it's basically wealthy whites have a lot of power, and the mayor and school superintendent have not been effective and have not been able to develop a plan to deal with that segregation. So some of the most segregated school systems in the country are not in the South today. They're in northern states like New York, Illinois, states with large urban areas. Here you can kind of see the racial composition of schools attended by different racial groups. So again, African American and Latino students still, there's a very strong percentage of those groups that do go to intensely segregated schools that are somewhere between 90% and more. With the busing issue, to return to that really quickly, I want to mention that from the reading, busing is mentioned and the Milliken v. Bradley Supreme Court case. This undid busing in Detroit, and that's something that I want you to remember, and that it led the Black community to, I think, to become pessimistic about integration, to feel that integration was unlikely to take place, and that schools were going to remain segregated. So it created, a focus rather on integration to improving predominantly Black schools. This is another key point that I want you to take from the reading, and more generally as teachers, I think it's really important to know. You'll often hear people say that the United States ranks, in the 20th or 30th percentile among industrial countries for, their performance on like PISA data in national rankings. That's true, but I think it's really important to know that when you disaggregate that data, the United States has some of the top performing schools in the world. A number of our suburban, well-funded school districts would be on par with the other top 5 performing countries in the world, and this makes sense. We have the best higher education system in the world, the best university system. We wouldn't have that if we didn't have good students. We do have good schools. We just have the most inequality among industrial or developed countries, and so when we average that out, we end up in the middle percentile. David Berliner is the person responsible for this study and disaggregating the data and writing about it. And I was able to talk to him. He spoke at Ball State a few years ago, and he actually shared these slides with me. So these came from his own research, and he uses poverty as a indicator. But what James Anderson wants to point out as well is that a number of these schools that are among the lowest performing in the world are our schools that are predominantly African American and Latino. Our underfunded urban schools tend to be the reason for this. With this, I want to mention that again, the Supreme Court is responsible, and courts around the country really are responsible for unraveling integration efforts. One of these happened in Seattle. I thought I mentioned with the passing recently of Ruth Bader Ginsburg that she was wrote a very compelling dissent against a number of these rulings, and wrote very strongly in favor of the integration efforts around the country. In spite of these losses, there are some really good attempts happening around the country toward integration in places like Boston, Louisville, Kentucky. So there are, and that's a good key takeaway that I want you to know, is that some of the best efforts around the country toward integration are happening on the local level, teachers and administrators working toward it. Another kind of key takeaway that I want you to know from the reading that I always like to highlight is that, to me, this reading really emphasizes the enduring legacy and commitment of the Black community toward education. And so I think both with the Du Bois reading and this reading, that would be kind of a key takeaway that I want you to have kind of on more of a personal level. All right, so I hope this helps better understand the reading.